Welcome to the Not Unreasonable podcast. I'm your host, David Wright, an actuary and reinsurance broker. This is a show of interviews with people who have something to teach us about managing our businesses and ourselves. There's a lot to learn out there, folks, so let's get to work. This show is brought to you by Beach, where I work and have worked my entire career. We are a global reinsurance intermediary, and we pride ourselves on creative thinking, deep analysis, and client service. Those three qualities are actually intimately related because you can't spend the energy digging deep into a problem unless you really care about the client. We find that when you really do understand the problem, the solution becomes obvious, even if it seems a little bit unorthodox to the outside world at first. The nature of insurance is to take solutions we know and trust and try to force them onto the problems of the day. We just don't settle for that. You can see further at beachgp.com. If you're an actuary, you, like me, probably dread the professionalism continuing education requirement. I think that the best time to satisfy this is in podcast time, while on your commute, while walking your dog, while mowing your lawn, while doing the dishes. Head over to notunprofessional.com where, for the price of a CAS webinar, you can get content dedicated to continuing education for actuaries, especially Professionalism CE. That's notunprofessional.com. Thanks for listening, and thanks for supporting the Not Unreasonable podcast. My guest today, Steve Mildenhall, is running for a position on the Casualty Actuarial Society Board of Directors. He made an interesting observation to me, actually, when I was asking him, why would a casualty actuary want to vote for you for the board? He said actuaries have been through three analytics revolutions during his career: catastrophe modeling, capital modeling, and predictive analytics. Actuaries are the traditional analysts of the insurance industry, and across these revolutions, in Steve's assessment, we're 50-50. Winners on capital modeling, in the sense that actuaries run the capital models of insurance companies. Tie on predictive modeling, in the sense that actuaries do run predictive models, but data scientists have been hired in many occasions to run predictive models at insurance companies. And complete losers on catastrophe modeling. I think that that's a pretty strong way of putting it, but cat modeling has spawned an entire industry of private organizations that are outside of the field of actuarial science, and so Steve may have a point there with that. In any case, for the analytics revolutions of the future, Steve believes that the Actuarial Society should be front and center. And in his view, an improved focus on education, implementation, and research is the way to do it. Steve got experience in all of these areas, being both a practitioner and an academic during the course of his career. So vote for Steve Mildenhall. Fellows of the Casualty Actuarial Society will receive an email, and you can vote anytime during the month of August. Go to the website casac.org. My guest today is Steve Mildenhall. Steve is Assistant Professor of Risk Management and Insurance and Director of Insurance Data Analytics at the School of Risk Management in the Tobin College of Business at St. John's University. Steve has 25 years' experience in the insurance industry. Prior to joining St. John's in 2016, he was the Global CEO of Analytics for Aon PLC, based in Singapore, and head of Aon Benfield Analytics. Steve received his PhD in mathematics from the University of Chicago. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So this is going to be what I hope is episode 1 of many of the Not Unreasonable Book Club, and hopefully, Steve, you can be my co-host in this little endeavor. Today we've got a series of books and papers that we'll be putting links up to as we cover them. We might have more than we'll cover today. We'll see. We're starting off with a book called Radical Markets, which was Steve's summer reading project while he was on holiday, and suggested it as a good starting point. And so I've now studied up on it, and so we'll jump into that. So the book is divided into a few different sections. We'll touch on them individually. Overall, the idea of the book is you can solve problems you might not have thought to solve before with a radical use of markets, and we'll talk a bit about that. The first market that they cover is one in property rights, and they have an interesting way of applying markets to I guess, dislodge the people's inefficient attachment to their own property. Steve, how am I doing with that description? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of putting it. Their basic idea was that you'd have a wealth tax that would be self-assessed, so you would post your sort of reservation price on assets you own, particularly property, and you would be taxed according to that value. But if someone else came along and they wanted to buy it, they could buy it at the value that you'd posted it at.
Yeah,
So
that's
it
your
sort
sell
of
price.
It kept you honest in your assessment.
Mm-hmm. And if you put your price too high, your tax bill goes up. If you put your price too low, somebody will buy your property.
Yeah, and they were seeing it as a way around sort of eminent domain problems and holdouts with, construction. You've bought every other house along the train, the right-of-way or whatever, and this would be a way of ensuring that those projects that would maybe have a greater social value would be able to proceed.
What do you think about the argument?
So, I mean, I like as a concept, it sounds great.
It's cute.
It is cute. As a person who lived in the same house for 25 years that I had an unreasonable attachment to, I sort of didn't like the idea that someone could come along and just, move me out of my house.
Yeah.
And I did think that they missed a couple of points. One was that presumably if I could post a low price, if someone then came along and bought it off me, they would then have to post a price and I could just buy it back, right? So there would be a sort of trading. It would almost be like sniping on eBay auctions where you'd have your listed price, but then in the back you'd have the actual price you'd bid up to.
Yeah.
So I think it would need to be a little bit more of a complicated market than they said, but the concept would still work. The piece that I struggled with was that they identified the use with the highest value as the use to which the person who would be willing to pay the most would put the property. And I don't think that actually is true, right? Often the person who is willing to pay the most for property has got their sums wrong. They've made some assumptions that aren't true, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's a sort of buyer beware, a winner's curse. And is that sort of bringing that down to I'm willing to pay the most, does that actually mean you've got the highest value use for the property?
Interesting.
So that was one observation. The other problem I had is, imagine your sort of 75-year-old widow who's lived on the coast in Florida since it was basically a swamp in a very modest home, which is now in an area that has become hugely gentrified. Should she be kicked out of her house because through no fault of her own it's been gentrified around her? That seemed to me problematic.
I agree with the sentiment of your response there very much so, because I think that I also have an unnatural attachment to where I live, and I think there are very good reasons for that. I mean, you think of, if we're confining this to a conversation about people's homes, which is not, so the authors would probably respond to this by saying, well, let's just start with commercial property, which I do make the point at one point in the book. And we can come back to that in a second, but I think it's worth saying that there are good reasons. I mean, communities develop around where you live, right? You have friends. I mean, I just put my kid into elementary school nearby, and now we're meeting all the parents, and man, do we ever feel better about where we live because we have friends and our kids have friends and we're all the kind of the same people, being their friends are the same people. And so that's worth a lot to me. And there's a non-monetary benefit to that, which is colossal, which it is unmeasurable because it's a social fabric of a community, which is something we all want. And threatening that, I think, is, one, it's just a bad idea, but two, would never work.
Yes.
Like, they would never be able to pull this off.
So there was that problem. The other problem they had was some of that math got a little flaky. They talked about an impact of this would be to lower property values by, I think, about a third.
Yeah.
And then they talked about that, your assessed value would be sort of net of any debt you have on the property. But if you lower property values by a third, everyone with a mortgage is underwater, and the whole sort of mortgage market
wipe out the
falls
entire
apart.
financial system.
So I think there's issues. It was an interesting concept, but maybe more of a thought piece than a practical.
One other story I'll quickly tell is a good friend of mine lived in a town called Hoboken, which is known to us as living in the New York area, and that was as a community. It's underwent enormous gentrification over the last 25 years, as most of New York City area has. And there's this friend of mine who lived in this, call it a row of townhouses on a block. And he and the rest of the folks in this little block were given notice from a developer who said, I will pay you 3 times what the market value of your house is. Some huge multiple. Like, I mean, it was like, okay, right? And the lady next to him said no. And you have exactly the problem they're talking about in this book, which is to say that because one person can say no, it threatens everybody in some sense liberty of being able to sell their house or not for the highest bidder. And so she's a woman who is, who knows, in her 80s or something. Let's just sort of picture her that way. And my friend went to her and said, why not? Why aren't you doing that? And she said, because I have nowhere else to go. I've never lived anywhere else. My kids are all gone. Where am I going to go? And it's like, good point.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, what are we going to do with that person? I mean, it's easy if you're setting up in the technocratic ivory tower to say, well, that's an inefficient outcome. We're going to have to move this lady out of the way. And they kind of abstract away to this, like, what are we all here for anyway?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, is the point here for somebody to have a slightly better, nicer highway? Right? I don't know if you've ever heard of Robert Moses or read up on that. So he was this guy that ran the parks, the New York Park Association, I think it's called, in the city. A real power broker in the New York political life in the mid 20th century. And one of the things that he was enamored with was cars. And so he built the highways. And one of the things he wanted to do was build a highway through the middle of Manhattan. And he was famous for trampling on property rights and eminent domain use and that kind of thing. And there's a famous woman who stood up to him, and she lived in the village. Her name was Jane Jacobs. And Jane Jacobs is one of these famous people, right? This anti-urbanization kind of person, development, any development. She's a much more complicated person than that. But it's the very same issue where she's standing up for communities and he's standing up for development. And they had this big clash, and she won.
I did not know that.
Against Robert Moses. All right, so anything else to say about this section on the property rights?
I think that's good.
Keep moving. Okay, so the next one is, we're probably going to skate through a couple of these. Voting. So buying votes with a quadratic cost. So you want to summarize that one, Steve?
So, yeah, quadratic voting is an idea that you should have, rather than just one person, one vote, you are given a allowance of what they call voice credits, which are basically votes. You could think of it as you're given a number of votes. And you can vote multiple times on a given proposal, but the cost of a vote goes up quadratically with the sort of strength of the opinion that you want to issue. So, for example, if I just want to vote once, it costs me 1 voice credit. But if I want to vote twice, it costs me 4 voice credits.
And vote not at all costs you 0.
For vote not at all costs me 0.
You can save them, right?
Yeah, you can save them as well. So you can save your votes up for the issues that really matter to you, and you can have a slightly larger vote on those issues, but it doesn't go up linearly. It costs you, each marginal vote costs you more and more.
Yeah.
Right? And the point, the quadratic function has got the property roughly that the margin is n, right? It goes up because the sum of the first n integers goes up like n squared. So they I thought the nice illustration that they used on this was that if you do survey data and you ask people, do you really don't care, don't care a little bit, kind of neutral, care some, care a lot, that sort of 1 to 5 scale, typically the responses you get are U-shaped. A lot of people really don't care, a lot of people care a lot. Well, that's probably not true, right? That doesn't actually ring true. Most people are kind of neutral about most things. So if you give them, you give them a survey and you allow them to vote like this with quadratic, they can vote, +1, -1, but they can vote +2, but it costs them 4 votes. They're forced to think about, okay, I've got this allocation of opinion that I can express, and how do I want to play my chips?
Yep.
And you can do surveys with this, and you actually then get a distribution of opinions across the issues that's much more normally distributed.
Yeah.
With much more what you would expect to see. So this seemed like an interesting idea.
Yeah. One of the things that occurred to me about that is what was interesting, and this touches on an actuarial topic, which we should touch on once in a while here, Steve, is their standard of evidence for that this is working is that they get a graph out the end, which looks like a normal distribution. And I was like, that is not a very good statistical test.
They had a number. I mean, the other issue that annoyed me about this was that they just boldly asserted that most reviews in Amazon are also U-shaped. And that's absolutely not true, right? It's right, exactly.
Excuse me, I will swear on this one
let's move on. Why don't we move on to some of the
there's one other thing I wanted to mention about that, which was there's a comment in there that I just didn't understand, and I'm wondering if you did, where they said that for some reason, this is supposed to make outcomes less extreme. And the thought that I had was, maybe this is evidence of the graph shape, right, where there's going to become a more smooth-looking graph, a more normal-looking distribution, as opposed to a more, distribution with, tail events, tail outcomes, 1 star, 5 star. And I just didn't understand that. Like, if you're allowing people to opt out, or opt in with more than their kind of 1 person, 1 vote, doesn't that make it more extreme? I just didn't understand the logic. I don't know if maybe you did.
I think that the point simply was that to express a very strong opinion costs you way more. And whereas it's free to, you can tell people I'm strongly for or strongly against. It doesn't cost you anything. You're sort of forcing a cost in the expression of the opinion, and so people will be a little more tame about how they express their opinions. That's how I understood that.
Yeah, and maybe the binary voting outcomes that's only available to us now, 0 or 1. Maybe there's something there about that being mostly we use zeros.
A lot of zeros, yeah.
Right?
They also talked about the ability to vote against someone. And
Yeah,
I wasn't quite
yes,
sure if
yes.
that was like shorting a vote and it created a credit on the other side.
Again, pretty cute.
It was potentially an interesting idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe a theme that emerged for me in this book was, and this is something that you mentioned to me when we were talking about initially discussing this book, is there's a lot of like neat ideas, but man, I'm not sure any of them work.
Right. Well, on this particular one, I was curious and I looked up one of the papers that was referenced, and it had Nash equilibrium in the title.
Yeah.
And I was quite surprised that it was 30 pages of fairly dense-looking math.
Right.
So I think on this idea, there's at least some
Okay.
solid theory that underlies it. Whether it will work in practice or not, I don't know.
Yeah. And obviously, thinking politically, anything that allows people to buy votes, I mean, that just
would be tough.
Toxic.
Although they a social dividend from the revenue.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll move on. So we're going to go over this one pretty quick too, I think, which is migration. And so maybe we can summarize the argument a little bit here, where they're trying to encourage migration because the feeling there is that there isn't enough migration, immigration or emigration. And that the idea was that you'd be able to, as an individual, sponsor an immigrant to come in and work for you. Did I get that right?
Yeah, so at the moment, corporations can sponsor individuals, and they were like, well, why not allow individuals to sponsor immigrants to come in? This chapter, frankly, had me feeling very queasy.
Yeah.
I mean, it
was
sounded,
long, too. Huh?
it sounded very much like creating a sort of underclass within society, and I was really quite turned off by this chapter.
Yeah. So let's move on to stock market voting, maybe another quick one for us, which is to say, and this is an interesting argument that I'd seen in a couple other instances where the premise here is that institutional investors, call it passive index fund investors, are actually, call it the majority a plurality of the ownership, a significant one of most companies. And so if you're a bunch of index funds who are passive investors and they own all of the airlines, I think the airline is the classic example here, then there's actually an incentive for them to encourage collusion and encourage price fixing and oligopolistic behavior because they don't care who wins because they own all of them. And so you have this functional monopoly or oligopoly, I guess, because of the ownership is common. What do you think about that argument?
So I think it's a good argument. I mean, and I like the way they phrased it, which was the guy from State Street or BlackRock or Vanguard or Fidelity has access to the CEOs. They own 6+% of the stock of a lot of these companies, and they can just say the same thing to all the CEOs. And it's nothing illegal. But they can have the guy thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't go after market share in a sort of zero-sum game. If I'm not growing the pie, we can all cut costs, and the net result is all our shareholders are worse off. So obviously it's a balance between the individual as the ultimate shareholder owner and the individual as the consumer, and how is that kind of squared away? And I think one of their points on this that was important was that because ultimately, you could say, well, we can solve this problem simply by forcing the institutional investors to kind of pass their votes through to the ultimate owners.
Yeah.
So the owners express an opinion, and then the institutional owner is forced to vote the opinion of their sharelders, owners,
sure,
rather than sort of having the proxy power.
Conduct a poll.
And they did, they make the good point there that to encourage people to vote, they have to feel like their vote matters on the margin.
Yeah.
And it's very hard if you're, one of 100 million, whatever, XYZ Corp shareholders to do that. So the institutional guys have that incentive because they own enough that they can see they're having an impact, but the individuals maybe wouldn't. And their solution was to allow the institutional investors to own a substantial share of a company, but if they own a substantial share of the company, they could only pick one company in each industry group, which is, I mean, as with
very heavy-handed.
One of my senses of reading this was that this was a sort of typical, let's introduce a little bit of a regulation here, and then you need regulation to make sure the regulation works, and soon you've got this big unworkable bureaucracy. That idea also felt very much along those lines.
Yeah. One of the things, and I was reading, because I've for some reason, have come across different articles and commentaries on this idea over time. And one of the interesting takes I heard on this was that, and I felt this urge too the first time I heard it, where my response was, yeah, but does voting matter? Or how much does it matter? And what's interesting at that point is you're kind of appealing to agency cost as a solution to this problem. So you're actually saying, oh yeah, but the markets don't work that well, and the shareholders aren't actually in control. And you kind of stop yourself and wait a minute, is that a good argument or is that a bad argument?
Well, it tends, I think the sort of corporate control, there's the incremental change, and there's the revolutionary change.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
And it's the revolutionary change, which is the takeover. Somebody comes in and cleans house with the senior management. That's, I think, what actually sharpens people's minds.
Yeah.
And
or you have an activist investor. I mean, think in our world, AmTrust with Carl Icahn turns up, shakes everybody out of a stupor, I guess, I don't know what it is, and gets the price raised that way. I mean, that was not an institutional investor action, and was able to persuade people, even with a minority of the votes. I mean, he didn't have that much, but he was able to kind of shake people up a little bit and get something done. And I think that the activist investor, the phenomenon of the activist investor is a pretty strong argument against this kind of thing, because they can sort of, wake people up a little bit more than they might otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think the chapter sort of was within the context of monopolies and anti-competitive behavior regulation, and I think they made the good point that maybe we've taken our eye off that ball a little bit. You know, it was a huge issue in the late 1800s, sort of through Sherman Act and what have you, into the sort of 1950s. And then one of the corollaries of the sort of Reagan-Thatcher deregulation was that we stopped worrying about that quite so much. We put our trust in markets. And I think they do raise an issue that, you look at a lot of industries are very, very concentrated. I mean, how many car manufacturers are there in the world now? There's a handful, right? And you've always got this problem of balancing economies of scale. It's cheaper to make things in bulk versus that, monopoly and market power. But I thought it was a valid point that it should probably be getting more attention. I wasn't convinced that the solution they had was probably be the practical way to go.
I agree with you. And we'll touch on some monopoly topics a little bit later on, I'm sure. But let's skip over to the last section of the book, I think, on data. So this was an interesting and thought-provoking section. The observation here being that quite a lot of the value that sits within a lot of the large tech companies, call it Google and Facebook, is that they are selling the data that they are taking for nothing from, quote unquote nothing, which I actually have a problem with that, because they're offering a service for free. So they're not, it's not as though the individuals who are giving up their personal data to Google and Facebook, which that Google and Facebook are using to sell advertising services or whatever else it is, they are giving something back to the consumer in the form of a service, which the consumer is paying nothing for. But in any case, the point made there is that Google and Facebook, there's a lot of value being aggregated in these organizations, the value of the data, and that's not something that's recognized in any monetary way.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this was the most interesting chapter, and this little phrase that they used to sort of coin it was questioning, should data be regarded as capital or data as labor? They're not completely clear on what they mean by that, but I think, the idea is that if data is capital, it's owned and consolidated by these big corporations, by the Googles, Facebooks, and it's sort of centrally controlled, versus data as labor is more of a individual ownership of our own data, and potentially selling our own data in the same way that we sell our labor on a daily, hourly kind of a rate. I thought there were a number of interesting things about this. I mean, they, to your point about we do get something in return, they had a very nice discussion of how the business model evolved that, that I think their argument would be basically the ship sailed on paying people for provision of data.
Sure.
We're all used to not paying for the services they provide. And if they were to pay us for the data that they give us, we'd have to pay them for the services we provide.
Right.
And nobody wants to sort of open either of those two cans of worms, right? And I personally am very happy with the bargain I get from Google. I'm not convinced that the data I give them is particularly valuable, but what I get out of Google is fantastic. It's an incredibly useful thing. I think Google has single-handedly increased the productivity, I would argue, of programmers and of academics everywhere, because I can now do a complete literature search, pretty much download every paper I want in an afternoon using Google Scholar. Amazing. It's just brilliant. I know how many citations it's got. I can link through, follow all the references. I can get it. It's just amazing. Yeah. And then programming, Stack Overflow. How many billions of hours of programming time has that saved that you could find your solution to your problem? So I think that they've actually provided sort of good service on the other end. One of the interesting things though that they did talk about with the way the data is provided for free is that it has an implication for the quality of data that these companies that can collect. So they talked about a lot of the data is collected sort of as a byproduct of entertainment.
Yep.
And they try and encourage people to, tag your photographs. It's hugely important, right? Having a library of photographs that are tagged and you know what they are of is just an unbelievably important thing. But it's hard to... People don't have to tag their friends in their photographs that they're going to share with their friends because everyone knows who everyone is, right? And because they're not explicitly paying for that, there's a limit to the quality of the data they can get, and they need to sort of the providers need to work around that set of limitations, which I thought was an interesting observation.
Mm-hmm. And data as exhaust from a commercial process is a common one, and my I don't know, gut reaction to that, and I see the argument probably a lot, which I don't really like it or I don't find it that compelling, because I think that a lot of times data isn't actually all that valuable, and I think that there's a lot of excitement and enthusiasm around data and having data and using it for something, but this is something that really resonates. This idea really resonates with me as an actuary, where you can get a lot of data, but it can be dirty in ways that you don't understand, and that can really contaminate what your conclusions you are drawing from that data.
Selection bias in particular. Yep. But I thought they did, their thesis to some degree was that, so they drew a parallel between the statistical value of data and this sort of machine learning value of data. And on the statistical side, typically what you're trying to do is you're trying to come up with an estimate of some parameter. And as your volume of data increases, the accuracy of your estimate sort of decreases with the square root, right? You got square root rule for the standard deviation. And you pretty quickly get to a estimate that's serviceable and good enough for what you're going to use it for. And so the sort of first, quantum of data is very, very useful, but the marginal utility of the data falls off quite quickly thereafter. They drew the parallel when you go to the sort of machine learning world. A couple of different things. There's been a sort of revolution in how machine learning works. So if you go back maybe 10 years, you think back to sort of the Deep Blue chess program, and maybe prior to that, machine learning worked by having a few highly qualified, highly trained individuals sort of put a lot of thought into basically the scoring function. So for chess, how do I score out the quality of this position of the pieces, right? And they would tinker with that, and that would be the approach they try and do. So it was relatively few people providing very complex input. The contrast to today, where we've gone to, and this is the sort of AlphaGo, AlphaZero model, is we essentially get a massive amount of very low quality data, right? We get all of these, we got billions of photographs that are tagged with, it's a face, or the famous, is it a muffin or a chihuahua, image, and we let the machine learn from that. So we don't try and tell the machine what to do. We let the machine learn by itself. And I think everybody's been surprised over the last sort of 5 to 10 years that we've somehow just reached the critical point for the volume of data, and that now all of a sudden these algorithms are really starting to work way better than anyone would have expected. I think the guy who invented, they had the quote right from the guy who invented neural networks, and he said 10 years from now I don't think anyone will be using neural networks. It's like, well, no, we're all using neural networks all the time. They work brilliantly well, but you need this massive amount of data to make them hum. And then they talked about, so what is the sort of marginal utility of data in that world? And I thought they had a couple of interesting examples. One was if you're doing voice recognition software, or even image recognition, but particularly voice recognition, 99% accuracy is pretty much useless, right? I'm not going to use a dictation machine that's only 99% accurate. I got to correct too many words. 99.9 is getting pretty good, but that's 1,000. But that's one error a page. I got to read it very carefully. you need super, super high accuracy. But if you can get super, super high accuracy, the tool becomes super, super valuable.
Yep.
So now you're not in a situation of decreasing marginal sort of utility of information. It potters along as kind of mostly useless, and then all of a sudden you hit 1 billion images and the thing explodes. It's unbelievably useful. You can identify everything. So I thought that was a fascinating kind of way of looking at this development.
It makes me think. So for this podcast project of mine, I use Google's API to transcribe them, and I hand them a WAV file, and I have to chunk it up, and I have to write this little script to do it, and it cost me about $1 a podcast to transcribe it. And the transcription is probably, 95% accurate. So it's not something to publish, right? I can't put it on the website and say, here's a transcript of the podcast. I have to go through it carefully. I use it to get quotes out for my little essays and stuff. But it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to use. It's not a commercial grade application yet.
I used voice dictation software for a while. I was very excited when I realized that I could actually talk very, very quickly and it could actually keep up with me because it was a computer.
Yeah.
But it's just not quite accurate. And there were words, the insurance words, that it never could learn.
Yep.
Cedent caused it all sorts of confusion. So.
Yeah, and I think that the maturation of that is, I think you're right. I like that idea that of the extraordinary disproportionate improvement in its utility for a relatively small increase in the kind of last mile problem, right? The 80-20 rule, the other way around, the 20-80 rule, right? That's the part that's really valuable.
And then, one of the points they made in the book in terms of sort of commercializing the data relationship was, I need a massive pool of data, but each individual's contribution to that data is worthless, right?
Yes.
I mean, Facebook does not care if I opt out of providing them data.
Yeah.
Because they've got 1.5 billion other people to work with. And the chances we could get 1.5 billion people all together to, data union, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. So, again, sort of speaks against a commercialization of the data provision.
Well, I think that it touches on, maybe we could transition to another one of the books we wanted to talk about. I don't know if we're following the plan that we laid out earlier, but it just really is drawing in my mind this picture of, you need to have a really big company to have a really big data, and the amount of information that is required to train these algorithms properly is colossal. And so you're almost requiring Google and Facebook to be huge, right? So the returns to scale of an organization that can control this much information are much larger than they were, say, 25 years ago.
So okay, a couple of things there. One is, I think Google and so you're kind of talking. I think that there's a little bit of hindsight bias going on there.
Sure.
That I think Google and Facebook are today in a position that is way, way better than they would ever have dreamt possible 10 years ago. They may have dreamt that they would have the volume of data that they have, but I'm not sure they would have been bold enough to dream that it would be as potentially useful as it seems like it's being. So I think they had the model of, what was it, revenue first, data users first, revenue later, right?
Sure.
The
classic Silicon Valley
URL, right? Users revenue later.
Yeah.
I think they've in a way they've just been lucky.
Yeah.
We couldn't have necessarily predicted it was going to work out like
Yeah.
this. And then on a sort of you're talking about large companies necessary maybe for insurance and whatever. I always like to think about, okay, well, so how does this apply? Let's get back to actuarial
let's do that.
topics. How does this apply to the insurance industry?
Yeah.
And I believe that a lot of these big data things that we see working incredibly well, they work very well in a sort of domain, a reasonably limited domain of problems. We talked about voice recognition, image recognition, these types of problems. There's a clear answer, there's a definitive answer, and it's an answer that's generally selected from a finite set of possibilities. It's a deterministic, more or less, system. I'm always going to get the same answer. The answer doesn't evolve over time, and the answer doesn't depend on sort of my understanding of the context. When you think about insurance just doesn't work like that. Insurance operates, I like to call it, in the twilight zone, right? If something's clear cut, you generally don't need insurance for it. You manage it, you manage the risk away, or you just accept it. Insurance is always going to be dealing with uncertainty, ambiguity. It's never going to be clear cut. It amuses me that all the .com people are like, oh, we want to make the claim process super objective.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, okay, so ether risk can do that for travel insurance. That's easy. But pretty much anything else, any claim you have, it's not going to be clear cut. Right?
Yeah.
And it's not a flaw. It's just reality. I prang my car. Well, what was the status? What was the shape of my car before I had the accident?
Mm-hmm.
How many of these things were pre-existing? You've got to, when you have an insurance claim, there's elements out there that will try and take advantage of that, and you have to manage against.
They try and screw you.
Yeah.
And I think that, so just to reference the book that I'm referring to in my mind here, at least, is Capitalism Without Capital. The book came out about, I don't know, a year ago or so, I think, and that's about the increase in intangible assets. And the observation that I think motivates a lot of it, a couple of them, one, that firms are getting larger, and another one, that the measured amount of what they call intangible capital, and they measure that in specific ways, which hopefully we'll get into in a minute, is increasing. So the amount of assets which are not physical assets, the proportion is growing. But coming back to insurance companies, and I think the thing that people misunderstand the most about insurance companies is that insurance is such a highly local thing. Right? So anytime you look at, in the United States, sometimes the United States is an interesting example here, because on the one hand, it's the most extreme version of this because you have state regulation, right? On the other hand, I feel like the idea of state regulation almost masks a true underlying variability with the political map, because the state regulation, to me, is appropriate not actually because the different political units, but because the people who live in those states are different, and they behave differently, and they use insurance differently, and they consider different kinds of organizations and people outsiders. My organization was recently sort of a reinsurance broker. My organization was recently acquired by an insurance broker, and I've been spending some time speaking to insurance broking people, and I'm a reinsurance actuary from outer space, basically coming down and talking to insurance brokers. And the thing that amazed me is how personal and regional the relationships are that actually deliver the insurance product. So that is I think a pretty powerful argument against standardization in data. And actually, so Travelers is very large, but Travelers is probably actually a collection of pretty small operating units, not pretty small for Travelers maybe, but that behave regionally and have regional relationships.
Right. Insurance is, when people talk about insurance as a personal business, there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah.
And that is, with most products, I sell you the product, I don't care what happens then.
Yep.
As long as the check cashed, I don't care. With insurance, I sell you the product, I absolutely care how you're going to act now. And we all know, moral hazard, you're probably going to act differently as a result of having the insurance. So your character and what I know about that matters. And that's why insurance is a personal business. It's all about knowing the customer.
There's a famous court ruling called Paul versus Virginia. Do you remember this from when you were studying for the exams?
I remember the name. Don't question me on it, though.
So this is in the original reading, my original reading of it, where you have to memorize a whole bunch of facts about this thing. It's kind of the original sin for state regulation, where I don't know that the authors intended it to be negative. Maybe they didn't. Maybe it isn't negative. Maybe that was just my reading of it. Because this guy Paul, I've forgotten his first, Samuel Paul, I think, was living in New York, but I think he was selling insurance policies in Virginia, and was trying, and there was some dispute in the question of whether it be regulated in Virginia and resolved in Virginia or New York. And the court ruling went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruling was insurance is a contract that is delivered locally. So there's this pretty powerful assessment by the legal authority there that insurance is regional. And what amazes me about that, because at first I thought, I think that maybe anybody who studies something imagines they know more than they do, and you're thinking, well, it should be federal regulation because insurance is, it's just we call it insurance everywhere. It's the same product everywhere, and it shouldn't be regulated federally. And I've come around to that. I don't agree with that anymore. I think that the local regulation of insurance is actually pretty appropriate, and I think that might be a contrarian view, but I think that the Supreme Court got that one right, and they tried to unwind it maybe 150 years later in the McCarran-Ferguson Act or something like that in the 20s, or was it, it was Southeastern underwriting. I mean, it's been a few years since I took the exam, so I don't remember these too clearly. But they unwound it and then rewound it again and reinstituted state regulations. So we're going back and forth on this in the United States, but I think that on balance, it's being regulated locally appears to be inefficient because they're duplicating services, right? Travelers, again, for example, is regulated by every single state. Doesn't that seem ridiculous? But maybe that's right. Maybe it should be. What do you think?
I think that's a very American view of things.
Sure.
It always amuses me that America is the free market, right? We run everything.
Yeah.
Competition is
total garbage.
It seems to work everywhere except in insurance.
Yeah.
And we allow competition in markets where there's 3 auto manufacturers and 5 gas companies and 4 airlines or what have you. There are 3,000 property casualty insurance companies.
Yeah.
That actually is a competitive market, right?
Yeah.
You can go out and get probably 10 plus realistic quotes on every single policy you want to write. It's absolutely a competitive market, and yet it's regulated to death. Let's take a broader view than just, a state versus let's look internationally, which no one ever does enough look internationally, in my opinion.
Sure.
You can learn a lot from seeing how things work in other countries.
Yeah.
So in the UK, there's essentially no regulation for auto rates. It is legal in the UK to run a 1-800 number and offer different quotes to every other caller. You can gauge price elasticity. Unbelievable. Does the market fall? And what is the result of this? The result of this is that the insurance companies make very little money. So we should wonder, the people complain about regulation. There's a market that genuinely is competitive. I think the last time it ran under 100 combined was a long, long time ago. And I mean, there's a slight downside to it, which is that they make their money then on selling maybe products, inappropriate. There's been a number of inappropriate selling settlements in the UK. They sold credit insurance knowingly to people who wouldn't be able to claim from it because they were self-insured, for example, self-employed. So you need some sort of market conduct regulation, but I would question why do we have any rate regulation?
I mean, I don't necessarily dispute that, honestly. I think that I agree with you that less rate regulation is better for the consumer. I think that one thing about the UK example that is, I think, not quite appropriate is that the UK is a pretty small country geographically, and culturally it'll certainly be distinct, but it's more like 1 or 2 American states, right? The United States is big. And there aren't really any other countries that are like that. I mean, you have Canada that's kind of that way. You have Russia. You have China. I don't know that there are too many other examples of developed economies that are that diverse internally. You have actually that much difference between different regions, and they're far apart. And so I think that finding the right analog internationally is actually a bit harder than maybe it looks. What do you think?
I'm not sure I would agree with that because, so even if you argue that the UK is just one state, it still doesn't have any regulation.
No. Well, pricing, it has some regulation, right? There'll be consumer protection. There'll be something.
Solvency, PRA regulation.
Yeah. I mean, auto rate regulation, again, I'll definitely grant the point that that's ridiculous for the most part, but that's not what all regulation is. I think that the interesting thing about insurance regulation to me is that it is solvency regulation. And we're working a little bit with a client of ours who is filing very high rates for auto liability coverage. And the regulator, he said he was worried that they would let him file high enough rates. And he said, you can file whatever rates you want. What you can't do is you can't increase them too fast once you already had them in, but you can start however you want to start because they're worried about backlash from consumers about changes once you've already established something and people being disrupted in their own financial planning for their own lives for whatever reason. So I think that the thing that makes insurance regulation very different from other regulation is that it's not actually entirely in the consumer's court.
Well, it's got also there's rate regulation, there's form regulation, there's underwriting regulation. It's a mandatory product, and then there's solvency regulation. Yeah. So even the regulator doesn't have. The regulator wants low rates in solvent companies. Yeah. Well, they have to make a decision. You can't have both. I do think that regulation around allowable rating variables is very important, and that we should the question that about price discrimination and using variables that are not directly related to loss but are related to other behavioral characteristics. That is something that, in my mind, should be regulated quite carefully.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can draw this back into this book at this point, which is Capitalism Without Capital. And one of the ideas that I just love thinking about is the idea that intangible assets have increased as a share of total assets. And insurance companies, I think maybe that's true. I mean, what do you think about, let's say an insurance company is growing and it's scaling across geographically across the United States. It has to file lots more filings, and is that insurance companies maybe are not a great example because they're entirely made of intangible capital, right? They're entirely made of
well, I would argue they're actually entirely made of tangible capital, right?
I mean, cash.
The cash is the only capital. So I think that this is an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
And it comes down to sort of, when you set up an accounting standard, which is kind of really what we're talking about here, what is it the objective of the accounting standard, and therefore what should I count as an asset?
Yeah.
If we think about insurance companies, statutory accounting is around ensuring that claims are going to be paid. And so it can only count assets that can turn to cash. Essentially, any other asset, if that asset is not going to turn to cash, it's useless. It shouldn't be on the statutory balance sheet. And I have perhaps maybe this is very real to me. I work for Kemper Insurance, which is a large $4 billion gross company in 2001 that went into runoff. Literally ran out of money. And so I had spent a lot of time building a model for them of their balance sheet, and it was really brought home to me. Every single item on the asset side or the liability side at some point has to turn to cash in order to be useful. And if it's not turning to cash, from a solvency perspective, worthless. Yeah. Now, there are other metrics that we might want to use, some sort of quote-unquote value as a going concern perspective. Absolutely, their intangible assets are going to be part of what creates the value. And you sort of actually get an amusing paradox, right, that a company can have a massive intangible value, which isn't on its balance sheet, but it gets bought, and then the company that acquires it has to book the goodwill, which basically is that, you sort of make it real at that point. And it seems like the accountants need to sort of work through that fact that if I've purchased it, it's on the balance sheet, and if I haven't, it's not on the balance sheet. That's a little problematic. And then I think, stepping back to an even broader perspective, we get to the question of measuring GDP and measuring, how the country is doing, where, go back to look at Google. Think of all of the industries that Google has basically taken out. The Yellow Pages would be one of my favorite examples, right? How many people did the Yellow Pages employ between selling the ad space, printing it, distribution? And let's face it, the Yellow Pages is a terrible solution to the problem of actually looking anything up, right? I want to get my smartphone out. I Google it. I get reviews. Is it open now? Is it busy now? How do I get there? It's a way better solution. But from a GDP perspective, it looks like we've gone backwards because there's a whole lot of people who are not employed. There's a whole lot of physical stuff that's not going on. It's been replaced by all this electronic stuff that doesn't really make it into the GDP statistics. But who would want to go back to the world? I would not want to give up at this. We're clearly better off. We're just not measuring it right.
No, that's right. I agree with that. But let me go back and try to defend my view again that insurance are intangible assets, right? So that what I was getting at there was that insurers are intermediaries, financial intermediaries, right? In the sense that they don't do anything other than take the money from consumers and give it right back to them. Premium comes in, claims goes back out, right? So there's obviously a net asset component, there's a surplus, of course, but most of the money is certainly a liability insurer that's sitting on their balance sheet. Most of what they are made of from a financial standpoint is obligations to other people and money they're holding for a little while. And when I talk about most of what insurance companies are, I suppose what I mean there is the enterprise value, the value over the cash in the bank account, because everybody can have cash in a bank account. Why does it sit in an insurance company? Is the reason for that is that insurance companies do something with it, and what they're doing is merely shuffling money around and organizing things and talking to people, and those are all intangible skills, and the value that they're bringing is one of certainty. That's kind of this mushy concept, right? As opposed to the counterfactual. I think that the example of what called the hardcore accounting argument against an insurance company would be if we just sort of abstracted away to the national balance sheet, right, in the United States. And here we can maybe touch on another paper that we were talking about, this Ken Arrow paper, which I'll maybe ask you to touch on, is when you kind of zoom way out, you're looking at, you have risks and you have capital, and you kind of want to match when a risky situation occurs, the capital will flow to it and will pay off the losses that happen there. That just ignores insurance companies. And so what are insurance companies doing? They're doing something there because they exist. And I say that value is entirely intangible. What do you think?
there's a whole webcast of discussions that we can have off that.
Well, we got another 20 minutes.
So, first, let's talk about so insurance clearly do have intangible value because you see it every time they transact, right? They're trading at sort of 1.5 to 2 times book, and then when they transact at there's control premium of that.
Sure.
So they've got an intangible value which is generally let's call it somewhere between 1 and 1.5 times their sort of stated book value.
Yeah.
I think so. I completely agree with the insurers or intermediaries. I think you downplayed a little bit about what do they do.
Sure.
So there's a people in finance love to talk about there's no free lunch.
Yep.
There actually is a free lunch. Free lunch is diversification. Diversification is the ultimate free lunch. It's an absolute miracle. And what insurers do is they give people access to the miracle of diversification.
Yep.
But that's quite tricky, right? Because what I need to, as the management of the insurance company, ensure essentially equity between my policyholders. That somebody whose risk I allow onto the balance sheet needs to be paying appropriately for the risk that they're bringing to the balance sheet so that my other insureds are not disadvantaged, relative to this new person who comes along. So I think of insurers, the sort of principal functions that they serve are, so going back to regulation, right? There's a whole lot of things where they have to provide a service that checks various regulatory boxes. And that people always think, regulate's terrible, we should just do away with it. And I know we shouldn't have rate regulation, but I do want drivers to have insurance, because if they cause me a tort, I want someone I can go and recover from, right?
Yeah.
And so insurers are enabling that service, which is very important. And then they're managing sort of the fair access between insureds to this pool. So I think that's very important. The Arrow paper that you mentioned, so it's I think the theory of risk bearing small and great risks is the name of it. It's I think only a 10-page paper.
Yeah.
And so for those of you who maybe haven't heard of him, Ken Arrow was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, extremely famous. Him and Debreu essentially proved that the competitive market equilibrium is a Pareto optimal allocation of resources. So whenever anyone talks about sort of competitive market is the way to go, you're sort of going back to Arrow. And Arrow's paper has a number of implications for how risk should be shared, okay? And what his paper says is risk will end up being shared through a large number of bilateral contracts. And the net effect of it is that all risk will be thrown into a pool, and then everyone will quota share the pool. And if you do that, you obviously get rid of all the diversifiable risk has gone away because it's all gone into the pool.
Yep. And
you're just left with a systematic risk. What's the size of the pool is the only risk variable that's left.
The only thing that should inform pricing at that point.
And then people's sort of the share that I come back is inversely proportional to my risk aversion. So if I'm more risk averse, I'm prepared to accept a smaller share back in exchange for having gotten rid of all of the risk, right?
Yeah.
And the more less risk averse people sort of take greater volatility. So and this was Arrow's theory that it's implemented through these things called Arrow-Debreu securities, which you may have heard of, which are a security that pays $1 in one particular state of the world. Okay, and that's the sort of fundamental insurance contract, if you will. It prices out all the states of the world, and then from that I can price any security, because any security is just a combination of these fundamental Arrow-Debreu securities. So this is a wonderful theory, and it all works kind of nicely. And
except it doesn't.
It works nicely in theory, I should say, right?
Yeah.
And so Ken Arrow's sort of observation around this is, well, the implications of this is that there should be a lot of risk sharing going on.
Yeah.
And we also notice that there's no place for an insurance firm within this Arrow-Debreu world.
And yet we see them everywhere.
And yet we see them everywhere. So I think it's a fascinating question of sort of why are there insurance companies at all in theory? Never mind in practice.
Yeah.
But the theory gives us a nice, Coase's theory of contracting costs and specialization and what have you. For most industries, we sort of understand why it makes sense for there to be a firm. But fundamentally, why would I exchange? In the Arrow-Debreu world, I'm allowed to contract, and my contracts never default, because they're always expressed in relative terms. They're always expressed of, I will give you 10% of what I have, not that I will give you $10. And so I can't, I mean, there's a enforcement issue potentially, right? Actually getting me to give you the 10% I've promised, but I always would have the capability to pay what my contract obligates me to pay. Why do we move from that world to a world where I contract through an insurance company that then can default? It doesn't make any sense. I think there's reasons for it, but that's an interesting question to sort of ponder, which is really where he gets to in his paper.
Yeah, my pet theory for what insurance companies do is so the word we use is underwriting, I think, is most of what they do. And the way I like to put that is insurance companies stop customers from screwing insurance companies, which means customers from screwing each other.
Yes.
Right?
Fairness in the pool.
Yeah, it's an evaluation of moral hazard. It's saying, is this guy a bad guy or a good guy kind of thing. And if they're good, then great, we'll get you some kind of price. And if they're bad, then there's no price for a bad risk. And so I think that there's a capacity for humans to deceive each other and try and make a play for the pool. You're saying, well, I have a claim on this pool in the event of some outcome happening to me or somebody else, and maybe if I just kind of like lied a little bit about what that's happening, and then I might be able to get access to that pool for myself. And so the moral hazard problem is everything.
Right, and so you're a smart guy, Ken's a smart guy, you both came to the same answer, right?
I did read his paper first.
It's moral hazard, it's adverse selection, and then it's also this whole complexity and ambiguity in contracting, right? That writing the contract is difficult, and so you give up a little bit in the quality of the risk transfer you get in order to have the practical implementation through an insurance company.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned in passing there a second ago, which we can maybe touch on now, the Ronald Coase's paper, which is another one on our little reading list here today, and we'll put a link up to all these things. And that was an interesting paper, and that won him the Nobel Prize, I think, in economics, which was amazing, really, for another fairly short paper, an easily readable paper written in 1937, still resonates today. And his question is, why do we have firms at all in any industry? Because if the market mechanism allocates things efficiently, to your point there, I don't know if Arrow's theorem had been
It's
afterwards, but we'll just take it for granted that the economic allocation of resources is efficient because of market transactions, because you have the price system that governs the value. And Ronald Coase says, well, why the heck do we have companies then? Because companies are not markets; they are command and control organizations where you have a CEO telling somebody else what to do, and they do it, and there's no price transaction between them. Why, Steve? Why don't you give us the answer?
So the argument against command and control is sort of amusing. Everyone looks at the government and, the government is necessarily going to be inefficient and stupid at doing things. And it's sort of amusing to me, or ironic maybe is a better word, that the sort of theory that sealed that came about just after the Second World War, that was won entirely on a command and control basis.
Yeah, sure.
There was
military to the original corporation.
The government, I think, in a way, gets a bad rap that regulators. What's the difference between someone working in government and someone working in a firm? Someone working in a firm can do what makes sense within. They have to do something that's legal, obviously, but they've got a lot of latitude, a lot of discretion about how they act. Someone who works for the government is typically implementing a law, and it can be the dumbest law in the land.
Yeah.
But they don't have any discretion about that.
Yeah, there's instructions.
And so they're I feel sorry for them because they're so far behind. That puts you so far behind doing the quote unquote right thing. If you can't get the law to change, you're hand tied, and all of a sudden you're stupid for implementing it. Well, no, it's a stupid law, and the legislature is stupid because they haven't changed it. You're just doing your job. So I think I just. Doesn't answer your question. But, so the answer to your question is Coase talks about contracting costs, specialization, economy of scale. If we went to a world where we didn't have firms and every service I needed, I tried to essentially outsource. I would outsource everything. We would just be spending our entire lives. We've all worked on statements of work and contracts, and then was the work fulfilled and do the bill, and it's a nightmare.
Constantly negotiating.
We don't want to be doing that.
Yeah.
It doesn't allow us to focus on what we do well, and so naturally you begin to kind of bring things within the 10, and you say, well, okay, this is a core function, this is a core function. And really his question is, how far out does that set of core functions expand? And do I do, for example, do I do my own HR administration, or do I outsource that? Well, I'm a software firm or whatever it is. I have no expertise in that. That probably is something that I outsource. But other things that are central, I certainly want to keep within the 10. So I think that, there's that range of arguments. I think also you could look upon the firm as a sort of collection of secret recipes for making things. That if you read about, and insurance is a great line. If we understand how insurance works, but there's various specialty lines that we're not so sure about.
Sure.
And you do a little bit of Googling, you generally run into a bit of a brick wall. Maybe there'll be one actuarial paper on this is roughly speaking how I price this, but no one's really going to tell you how they do it. You need to talk to someone who actually does do it, who is within the sort of firm that has it. And I think it's that aggregation and sort of profiting from private information is a core characteristic of what a firm is. It goes back to what we were talking about, the intangible assets and what have you from the beginning. So I think that's also an important part of what firms provide.
Coase makes a few comments in the paper, implications about that, what kind of firms will be larger and what kind of firms will be smaller, and he really does kind of foresee a lot of the arguments that wind up coming out of Capitalism Without Capital, where firms that have lower transaction, find a way to have lower transaction costs industries that have lower transaction costs will wind up having more firms, more firms, right? Because you have more decentralization of the services, and firms with high, industries with high transaction costs, think like, I think that, industries where, like, we're the biggest firms, right? You have the energy firms are the biggest ones. Insurance companies are pretty big, actually, which is interesting. Maybe I'll pause there and ask you what you think about this. Why are there very large insurance companies? It feels to me like a lot of the forces are pushing them in the opposite direction.
Well, okay, so I'm not sure I completely agree that in the U.S., there's moderately large insurance companies. Maybe this goes back to your point about shouldn't think of European countries as equivalent to the U.S., but you go to Europe, Aviva, AXA, Generali, Allianz. And Zurich, I guess, right? They're huge.
In Japan, another one full of big ones. Yeah.
Well, they've all merged together in Japan.
Yeah.
So they started off with more companies, but in the U.S., we've got a reasonable number of sort of the top 20 companies. I guess you're right. It's a little top-heavy. I think you get personal lines has greater economies of scale than commercial lines, right?
Yeah.
And commercial lines, you have specialized underwriting, which doesn't really scale, but you need a lot of capital. But the capital you can bring in different ways. You can reinsurance, you can off balance sheet the capital. On the personal line side, you sort of need to build. You've got a massive number of homogeneous risk units that you can process, and there's going to be efficiencies to doing that together. Efficiencies of pricing, just efficiencies of processing,
right? All the intangible assets,
right? The brand that the companies make. So I think personal lines sort of naturally gets to be bigger. Commercial lines needs a big balance sheet, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a big company. Because of going back to insurance, every risk is unique, and I've got to understand each individual risk. A given underwriter can only understand so many risks. And I think that actually is an interesting observation about why certain large covers don't exist in the marketplace. I can go out today, a Japanese company or an Australian company can go out and buy probably today $10 billion of cat. It used to be $7.5 billion with the biggest programs. I suspect it's $10 billion today. But if I'm Pfizer or some manufacturing company and I want $10 billion of liability cover, I can't get that. Well, obviously, it's not the size of the risk because it's provided for cat. And let's face it, for cat, you're going to write the check out in 2 weeks after the event. I mean, the money flowing into Japan after Tohoku was
hard to fake it.
Right, yeah, that was real.
Yeah.
I think that the reason that there's sort of two reasons why those covers don't exist. One is that the return to underwriting skill, which is our scarce commodity, right? The capital I can get. There's capital everywhere.
Yeah.
But the underwriting skill to go through the books and to parse all the public information about a big manufacturer and decide, okay, this is the price I'm willing to put on them. The problem with doing that is I've now done precisely one manufacturer. Mm-hmm. And it's not going to be the same for the next guy. They're all going to be kind of different. And then I get to a price, what am I going to think? I'm going to think, well, if they buy at that price, they obviously know something that I've missed, and they're a bit complicated. They know more about their risk than I do. So I think that's, I know it was always an issue. We were always trying to figure out how can we upsize liability in particular? Why isn't there more liability purchased? And I think it goes back to the information asymmetries, but it goes back to it's not a good return on scarce underwriter resource and skill to do that, because you are fundamentally doing it one insured at a time.
There's also an emergent aspect to this, I think, where I know some folks that run insurance companies who think very strongly that this is a game between the call it the legal judiciary system and the insurance industry, where if you wrote a smaller limit, you just have a smaller loss. Where the whole system's organized you're calibrated to the insurance limit that's available. And so the reason why you don't offer higher limits is because they would just take them. And they want to achieve their economic outcome from a particular trial or a particular event, liability event. So let's define that, squishy. And that outcome is insurance matters, but if they want to screw the company, they're going to go at the top of the insurance, no matter how high the insurance is. Right? If there's not any kind of basis in an underlying actual, there's damages and stuff, I guess, but it's all negotiated, and it's, again, a big mess. And so that explanation, which is kind of a cynical one for why there aren't very good limits, is because they don't need bigger limits. You actually could use smaller limits, and you wouldn't change anything. You would just sort of less of a transfer of wealth during an event. What do you think about that argument?
I think I could see that for larger losses. I think we've stuck at $1 million limit for way too long. How can it still be because, okay, so maybe we should sort of back up to, in my mind, I divided insurance into, there's property. Yeah. Then there's what I call sort of broken and injured and killed lines of business, which they felt sort of a little more real to me. Yeah. And then there was the sort of slighted and insulted lines. Your D&O, EPLI. That I was never quite so comfortable with those lines, quite frankly. But that when people are being killed and injured and maimed, $1 million is not what it used to be. Those people should be buying $10 million. I'm sure you've seen trucking large losses, right? I mean, they're horrific. Probably trucking firms should buy $25 million of limit. And it's not, I don't think that falls into your cynical, view of things. I would agree probably on some of those other, on the slighted and insulted lines, I could see it.
But here's an argument against that in some ways, where the region in which you are insuring affects how much insurance limit you have to buy, right? And even within the United States. So we're kind of holding constant the medical system for the most part. And let's say you're in South Texas or South Florida, or you're in Wisconsin, right? Place where you spend some time. Very different legal environments, right? They probably need to buy different amounts of insurance limits. To me, that's an argument for local culture really, really attacking the insurance limit, maybe call it the legal culture, the lawyers on the billboards, which you see when you drive around the South. And those guys are predators of insurance limits. And I think that if you shrunk their limits, you probably would shrink the total cost of the. But you have this tradition where it's hard to break. I think this competitive equilibrium whereby you're used to having it, so you have to have it. And if you don't buy it, you're kind of scared. Well, what if it goes up the top? And the insurance company would probably say, "Well, don't worry about it. It won't go at the top." And they're like, "Well, yeah right."
Yeah. No, I think I agree with that. I think the poster child example is Michigan.
Yeah,
where they have the unlimited PIP.
Yeah.
And at least a couple
perennial
of years ago...
basket case.
A couple of years ago, the MCCA, which is the Michigan Catastrophic Claims Association, they reinsure individual PIP claims. It used to be above $250,000 per person. Now it's, I think, $500,000 per person. Until just a couple of years ago, the MCCA had higher undiscounted loss reserves than AIG.
My God.
Just for reinsuring PIP in one state for personal auto... excess of $250.
Talk about broken.
They had $65 billion, I think, of undiscounted loss reserves.
Wow, amazing. So we're running out of time, Steve. I wonder if you can close. Maybe if you could talk a bit about. I mean, you're working on. You're in the world of ideas now, permanently, which is pretty cool. I wonder if you maybe talk a little bit about sort of things you're thinking about and working on right now.
So I'm working on risk measures and understanding risk measures. I actually worked with John Major, Don Mango, and Jesse Nickerson we did 3 sessions at the CAS spring meeting that was just held in Boston on distortion risk measures, which sounds...
Okay. What is that?
What is it? So a distortion risk measure is essentially saying to measure risk, what I should do is I should think of all my outcomes and I should just make the bad ones more likely. Okay. And
Sounds
so that
reasonable.
increases my mean, and then the increase in mean, that gives me a sort of risk margin. There was a lot of interesting stuff came out of that. It would be more...
Yeah, another
conversation.
round 2, yeah.
For round 2. But one of the key ones was thinking about the definition of an event. What is an event? And this sort of really goes back to what we were talking about with Arrow and in finance, where people think of events as tangible things. So it's in insurance speak, CAT models give us tangible events, right? It's a Cat 5 hurricane makes landfall in Miami, blah, 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 and I can think about the losses that come out of that.
Yeah.
And if you look at finance, you go back to your Arrow Debro securities, they cover tangible events in that way. In insurance, most of the time, we don't know what our event is to that detail, as we've already discussed. And we've identified the event with the loss outcome. And
the insurance outcome, as opposed to some natural world outcome.
So that the ground up, what maybe from a CAT model you call the ground up view, right?
Yeah.
And then you're going to layer, there's going to be a retention and limit and what have you. But we've identified it with that. And that causes the problems. Partly it gets us to this question that I know actuaries love about, should we think of value at risk or tail value at risk, right? And it reconciles that problem because the value at risk view is I'm thinking of covering one event, and it is the event that causes a loss of 1,000 or whatever.
Yeah.
But we never write insurance policies like that. We always write insurance policies that cover a loss of 1,000 or more. Right. So even if you do your little thin layer, people love to think about little thin layer things. So if I write a policy that's $1 x 1,000, it will respond to a loss of 1,000 or more.
Yep.
So it's a TVAR kind of a view of things. Whereas if we go to the sort of strict finance view, finance would have a policy that would only cover the event of the loss being 1,000. So it would cover just that one event, and then if the loss was 1,001, it wouldn't cover anything at all. Now, that has sort of very profound implications for things that in finance you would think would work in one way, but then in insurance they work in a different way. And we need to make sure, as we're translating from sort of pure finance into insurance, that we're sensitive to that difference in the definition of an event, and that we're always thinking our events are essentially that always tail events. And where it came up, to close out maybe,
I was just going to ask you that.
Where it came up in this CAS thing was, okay, so if I make my bad outcomes more likely, I have to therefore make my good outcomes less likely.
Okay.
So now so you imagine, you've got a table, loss of 100, 200, up to 10,000 or whatever. They've all got probabilities. Let's say they start off as equally likely. And then I adjust them, right? So I increase the probabilities of my bad outcomes. I've decreased the probabilities of my good outcomes.
And the reason for this is to just represent risk aversion.
Right, a risk aversion. And you're pricing things with respect to these adjusted probabilities.
Yeah.
Okay. So John Major sends out this email, I just remember, like Thursday evening. He said, well, it seems like we've got a bit of a problem here, because what if we take a policy that is just covering the good outcomes, the probabilities are lower than the objective probabilities, right? Because probabilities add to 1, right? If I make something higher, I have to make something lower.
Yeah.
That seems like I'm going to end up with an insurance policy that I'm going to sell under cost. And we don't like, obviously that doesn't seem like it makes sense. And he called this the big honking problem. I was like, how do we solve this big honking problem? And I sort of basically I found this just fascinating. Right?
Yeah.
It completely consumed me for about the next sort of 40 hours. And then I finally realized, well, it is a problem if you ever sold a product that only covered the small losses. But you never do. You always sell a product that covers the small losses and above. And because it covers small and above, the increase in likelihood of the bad events outweighs the sort of discount you offer on the small events, and any realistic insurance product that you would sell will always be priced above objective cost. But you could have, and the example that comes up, the one example of a product we sell that only covers sort of certain outcomes is term life insurance, right? If you think of term life insurance, it's saying, I cover you if you die within this band. So it's sort of like if the loss equivalent for that would be, I'll cover your loss if it's between, $10,000 and $20,000. But if it's more than $20,000, I'm not covering it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't sell products like that. But with term life, and the reason we don't, obviously, is there'll be all sorts of hazards, right? You got a loss of 21,000, loss of, I'll persuade the guy to make it only 19, and then you got to cover it. Well, with term life, you're pretty attached to being alive, so you're not gonna cheat on that one. So it's okay to have that product as an insurance product. But that's really the only example I could come up with. It's franchise deductible. The franchise deductible part of a franchise deductible also has this, right? It only applies to small losses, and then it drops to 0.
Mm-hmm.
So the sort of solution to the big honking problem was, it's a problem in theory. It's not a problem in practice because we don't sell the products for which it would be a problem.
Yeah, neat. Well, we'll stop it there. We're out of time, Steve. My guest today is Steve Mildenhall. Steve, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.